Here to discuss this week's top stories is the Menzies Research Centre, Nick Cater. Nick, let's start with today's High Court decision. We've got the 20-year-old precedent overturned, ruling indefinite immigration detention is unlawful. This government is already beginning to release dozens of people being held in detention. The opposition is claiming such a swift release could pose a security risk to the Australian public. Deputy Prime Minister Richard Marles said this release will follow all the correct steps and will not pose a threat.
I absolutely understand the concern that members of the public will have. What the government will do, everything within its power, is to ensure that this release happens under the strictest possible conditions, and we will be assessing our options once the full decision of the High Court is made public, and we can go through the reasoning of the court decision to work out what our next steps are, but we will ensure that those steps are absolutely legally robust.
Nick, the most disturbing thing about this High Court decision earlier this week is that a man who raped a 10-year-old boy is set to be released.
Yeah, Richard Marles says that's an issue of concern to the Australian public. Dead right it is. They're dead right. This is a man guilty of a serious offence against a child who's going to be on the streets, presumably because of this High Court decision. But there's another big concern here too, Rita, of course, which ordinary people will be very concerned about, and that's what message we're sending to people smugglers and people who want to come here illegally. Because we know in the past that any softening at all of our regulations will have an effect on the inward migration. So there are two big matters of concern, and the question is, what's the government going to do about it, apart from just saying it's concerned?
Oh, well, let's hope they've got some plans in action, because they knew this decision was coming, and you would hope they would have a plan for whatever decision was going to be. Now, let's talk Israel. They've agreed to hold daily military pauses in Gaza as Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu insists Israel does not wish to reoccupy the Palestinian territory. They're going to have, Nick, for 4 hours a day, a pause to the fighting to allow civilians to flee. US President Joe Biden is stressing there is not going to be a ceasefire. Meanwhile, we're learning that a Chinese Communist Party aligned activist hub in New York City is helping to organise pro-Palestinian, anti-Israeli protests in the US. What a shock, Nick, that China wants to see increased racial and religious tensions in the West.
Yeah, what we're seeing in Gaza is a proxy war, as you know. Hamas are the immediate combatants there. But behind them is Iran and also China and Russia. I mean, this is the new axis of evil. And it is of great concern that China is having this influence in our public debate. And I worry, Rita, about TikTok. A lot of people get their news these days from TikTok, which I think is an even worse source of news than the ABC, to be honest. But, you know, I mean, if they're getting there, if TikTok is run by a Chinese company and is in charge of news on something like this, where China is deliberately trying to push the Palestinian cause and create disruption in the West, then I think this is something of great concern.
Oh, TikTok is an ongoing concern on so many levels, and we really need to start taking it a lot more seriously. Now, we love Andrew Bogut on this program, the former NBA star and full-time Aussie legend. He posted this on X, formerly Twitter, about a 3-year federal government campaign addressing toxic masculinity on social media. Bogut responded with this. He said, "Dear Albo, I'll raise my 2 boys to be good people without telling them they could be toxic because of their gender. I'll raise them without your government-funded lackies telling them they are toxic simply because of how they are born. I will, however, raise them to know just how toxic governments are." I've got to say, I back him. I am so sick of this messaging around toxic masculinity that's aimed at boys. I've got a teenage boy, And these messages are so destructive, and we've got to stop doing that. We would never dream of talking about toxic femininity with our girls, but with boys, that there is no protection. There's no concern about what this does to their mental health, what this does to their self-image.
Yeah, this is the usual toxic woke nonsense, isn't it? From people who think they can change the world by reinventing the English language. You know, it is very concerning that this, which of course starts in the weirder institutions in our universities, has not only crept out of the universities, but is now being picked up by the government as part of a campaign. They should think long and hard about the position that many boys and teenage boys find themselves in these days, not really knowing how they're supposed to behave, how they're supposed to act. There's an increase in mental health issues and suicide issues, as you know. So, you know, I think that it's about time that if we had a government that was really had an ounce of brain or principle, they would be stamping on this language, not celebrating it.
And the fact that they do it in the name of women's safety, I think, is also completely counterproductive, because linking this stuff with women's safety, when that is a real issue, a serious issue that deserves a far greater response than a program about toxic masculinity. Now, before we go, this data was highlighted today by Shadow Minister for Social Services Michael Sukkar. He points out that while Albo was obsessing about The Voice, Australia was experiencing the worst collapse of real household income in the developed world. Let's have a look at this graph. It shows real household gross disposable income per capita has gone backwards by more than 5% in Australia. Australia is the one at the top there in red, much more than Ireland and Austria and Canada and others, which also went backwards. But many other countries you can see there, Nick, like France, UK, Spain, saw increases. Australia has really taken a hit.
Yeah, it has, Rita, with you know, families in particular, and mortgage holders, of course, have been hit by this really hard. You know, roughly a third of households who have mortgages, they've been taking the big hit on this for inflation and interest rate rises up yet again. But this is a serious matter. It's not evenly distributed, of course. You know, you can walk around Mossman or those sort of areas and you wouldn't even know it. But, you know, you go to other places in Australia where people do know the price of bread. They do know what it's like to have to put $200 worth of fuel in a Hilux. You know, this is really serious now for households and families, the very people that we should be looking after. And the fact that the Albanese government doesn't seem to have anything to say to them, let alone anything useful to say, I think is really a great shame.
Absolutely. Nick Cater, thank you so much for your time this evening.
Thank you.